of medley, the mix.
The mashups.
We steal, the mashups.
Yeah.
We steal trends or sounds or things from previous generations' music, and we put it into our sort of own thing.
Well, it's funny you say that because, I mean, there's a lot of cover songs, right, for example. But then you go back to the 80s, we had a ton of cover songs that were hits that were from the 60s and the 50s. So,
but your generation made whatever the words and the themes were, and they made it uniquely.
Beyond those cover songs, yes. I mean, there are other things that were being created. I mean, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I think it's funny when you look at the music of the Generation X, and it kind of defines it really well. On the one hand, we have a lot of happy pop songs.
Yeah.
And, you know, the 80s were such a happy time, kind of like the 50s is the way I've heard it said. But then you also had this alternative stuff, The Cure. What was REM's one of their biggest anthems? It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine, you know. And then there was this song from the Smiths. I think it was called "There Is a Light That Will Never Go Out." And to paraphrase the chorus, it's a great song, but it's like, if I should die in a horrible bus crash today, at least you're by my side, and everything is great.
So there's always, even in the joyful, happy medleys and songs, there's always this like undercurrent of cynicism to some degree.
Right.
Well,
in
the pop music.
We'll get more into, I think, what that really is. But
so we talked about the overarching mentality, and I've also talked about how each generation has had its kind of capstone moment or theme. So what would you say is kind of the capstone sort of moment that defined or solidified the identity of the Gen X culture? I've heard one that I'll bring up if you don't pick it.
Well, there's two. I mean, you know, again, part of the point of the Gen X generation is we didn't have one initially.
Yeah.
And, you know, so what are we? We're Generation X. It sounds like something invented in a lab or something mysterious. And I think you could possibly point to the end of communism, the fall of the Soviet Union, the tearing down of the wall. I think maybe the bigger one would be the beginning of grunge music, just as a culture.
Yeah.
You know, that was during my college years, but I didn't identify with it. I just kind of observed it. I'm like, it's not me.
Yeah.
And I've talked to other millennials, even some millennials, Gen Xers around here, and they've said the same thing. So it certainly defined part of our generation. Yeah. What I found interesting was jumping ahead and looking at 9/11, which I know is very defining for millennials. It was defining for us too, but I didn't even think of it at the time. I mean, I was 25 or so, and working with the youth group. We had a youth worship service at the church I was at the time, and I just remember with the DCE, we were, you know, trying to sort that all out with them. But what's interesting, what I read, is that so many of the first responders, including even the people on Flight United 83, were my generation. So that was kind of our moment to step up and face adversity. Yeah. You know, kind of a mini version of the Greatest Generation.
And a lot of the people who signed up and went off to war were Gen Xers or the kind of cusp, you know.
Right, both before and after the two Iraq wars that we had were my generation. So I never even thought of it from that perspective, like, oh yeah, we were the ones running back into the building or dealing with all that. So.
One of the kind of indicator capstone moments that I saw in some of my preparations and for this discussion was the impact that the Challenger disaster had on Gen X, because a lot of people were students in '85, I think, when that, or '86 when that happened, and so they actually, because there was a teacher, Chris McAuliffe, is that right?
Yeah.
Was
this
on
was
the
just
flight.
on This Is Us. There was an episode about this very thing, actually.
So the children were all watching the shuttle launch because it was like, hey, the first teacher in space. This is really neat. And the hopes and dreams of a generation exploded.
Literally.
Literally. And it was like a traumatic, impactful moment where everyone remembers where they were at that time. And to me, that was like, oh, that sort of makes sense. And it has sort of that air of sort of cultural cynicism that, you know, you shoot for the stars and you're going to fail, you're going to blow up, but it's okay. You know?
Well, I mean, just disappointment, right? You think it's a man on the moon kind of moment. And then I don't remember if we watched that in class or not. I remember which grade it was. Yeah. But I don't remember it being so traumatic. So I'm kind of thinking what happened was I was in class and then it was announced.
Yeah, announced.
And then kind of sad about it, but it didn't quite affect me. I'm sure the same way as like this Is Us episode that I just referenced. They're watching it on TV, and then literally right before their eyes it's happening, and you see them go from I mean, and I can imagine that would be traumatic. Like you said, it kind of covers what we're talking about with Gen Xers, I suppose.
Well, okay. Well, let's maybe go ahead, and that's sort of a review or an overview of this generation. But let's get into that second question there. Give me some ideas that you have on thoughts about how Generation X is described. What do you see as some like misconceptions? What do you see things that are inaccurate, or what do you think is like accurate about the way that society at large portrays your generation?
Well, I mean, the first thing, and by the way, Chris looks like the camera disappeared. The reactive part I struggle with a little bit because I suppose there's some cynicism towards cultural things, towards government stuff. Again, I could point to the previous generation before me and the one after me, and there's plenty of that there too. So I feel like that's spread around and doesn't really define Gen Xers as much. I would think one of the things that kind of leaps out at me is being called the MTV generation. We're very visually oriented. We're the generation with desktop computers. You've made comments before where I'll make references to movies and stuff like that. And to me, it's because I'm looking for that common cultural touchstone. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right? And so you say something and it gives people an impression of what you're trying to say. I remember there was a TV show that was kind of like that, where a guy's talking to someone, and maybe it was his dating relationship, and then he had a thought of an old movie in his head, and they would show that, and that's kind of how I operate. But is that Gen X, or am I just a pop culture geek? It's a little bit of column A and B, probably.
I think perhaps you're an exaggerated version of what your culture would naturally produce, right? That you're
in some ways, but in many ways, I'm not Gen X at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I think from a moralistic standpoint, for example, I just kind of, because of my faith and my upbringing, I was just kind of on the sidelines going, I don't know about you people, But at the same time, because I so readily, we'll get into this with me, how I grew up, but I was kind of stuck at home a lot, trying to figure out what to do with myself. And so embracing listening to music, absorbing things through TV and computer and reading and stuff, I'm a pop culture geek in that way. But, some are more that way and some are less that way in my generation. So again, I don't think that necessarily defines it, but certainly a strong characteristic of it. One thing that stood out as I researched this is that Gen Xers have a strong sense of individualism, and that I relate to a lot. Again, it's kind of thrust on me with my upbringing, but because of all the moving that I did as growing up, I just had to kind of forge my own path and go my own way. So I know that identifies with a lot of Gen X people. But I was just going to say that what I found interesting about Gen X is that, I mean, to me, when we were defined in the 90s, the two A words that came up were angst and apathy. And it was almost a joke. You'd see it in media as like, well, whatever, man. Like you just don't care about anything. And, I'm like, I care about things. What's wrong with you guys? But as we get older and as we've mellowed with age, now that's very much applicable to me, but it's kind of a different, like, I don't care. It's whatever. It's more like I don't worry about the small stuff or even some of the big stuff. And I think some of that's because our generation has had scandals and catastrophes, at least being force-fed to us through our entire lives, starting with Nixon, for example, happened during our generation. And most of us are too young to even remember that. So then as we grow up, it's like, well, Republicans are bad. Look at, this is what Richard Nixon did, blah, blah, blah. And then, you start talking about other controversies, global warming. I mean, that's all we've talked about my entire life. The sky's falling, and we're still waiting for it to happen. So after a while, it's sort of like, yeah, whatever. I'm not as worried about that because it's beyond my control.
After your 95th crisis this year,
right.
You're like, I think I can manage these crises.
Well, so there's some Gen Xers who I'm sure are like, whatever, we're all going to die and there's nothing to do and there's a big emptiness in my soul. And then there's me and hopefully others who are like, whatever, it's beyond my control. But thankfully, I know who is,
Yeah,
so
perhaps that speaks to the way that the church can reach out to more Gen X folks is to kind of confront the reality of that whatever man, but I know who's in control kind of idea. I think that there's a lot of exertion of control kind of thought process behind some other generations. We are the masters of our fate and the captains of our own destiny.
Right.
But I think that Gen X doesn't have that. Some personalities do, but Gen X in general kind of has more of that like que sera kind of attitude,
Exactly.
right? And we're gonna just roll with the punches and find ourselves on the right side of the outcome, and things will be okay in the end.
You do what you can, or a song lyric recently that I really enjoy is like, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future.
Yeah,
and I hope more Gen Xers would embrace that rather than just, oh, well, we're all going to die, and let it be.
It's not exactly a mentality that makes life very good for you or for others around you. It's like, whatever, we're all going to die anyway.
Well,
that's not a mentality.
Leslie's always said that to me. She's like, I just don't understand how people can't have faith, because what do you have to live for then? To just kind of have this atheistic worldview and say, well, this is all there is. And I mean, you would just be without hope with the COVID crisis going on right now, or if you are really into global warming and worried about that, I mean, you would be full of despair.
Yeah.
And I don't find, again, this was interesting to me then, to find that so many Gen Xers are so well adjusted was shocking to me, because you kind of got the impression when I was growing up that we're all going to be, going through therapy in our 40s or something. And it's been quite the opposite from what I've read.
There are trends, and I think this has to do more with technology than with culture. But one of the things or monikers that's been ascribed to Gen X is the chemical generation. And it's the skeptical way of saying that is you guys are all on drugs. But what it when you think about it from one side, it's like, well, are you talking about crack cocaine or something pretty gnarly, or are you talking about like prescribed prescription medications that help balance out like some of the worst mental depression and other hard attributes that people are enduring in life. And we have the technology. We've developed the technology now to address several issues that people just had to live with, not but 40, 50 years prior to that.
Right.
And now we have something to perhaps we've gone too far down the rabbit hole and over-medicated to some degree, but for the fact that we have those prescription medications to address so many health issues. I mean, it's one of the reasons you see life being prolonged so much now, and
Sure.
Quality of life later in life being better and things like that is because those things exist. So, when you brought that up, I was just thinking about that chemical generation kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's come across my reading too.
Yeah, let's move on to number 3 here. So tell us about your childhood. What was it like, and what were some of your influences? What was your family like? What kinds of things did you like?
Yeah, so I mean, both my parents come from the Midwest, predominantly Germanic families. My mom actually moved with her mother to the West Coast at a young age, to California. My dad stayed in Indiana for most of his life, where most of the Brian Myers and Cruzies are. I was going to say to this day, but obviously we have a lot of Cruzies here now, including our congregation. And so anyway, he studied at Purdue, took a job that eventually led him to California, where they met at the campus LCMS Church for University of Southern California, where my mom was, and they got married. 3 years later, I came along, and it was a very happy childhood, but we had a lot of moves. I mean, we moved twice, I believe, in California. Then we went to Chicago in the mid-late 70s, and then in 3rd grade for me, I think we moved to Indiana, came back to Chicago in 5th grade, moved to Ohio for my high school years. People are like, oh, you must be in the military. No, just the job my dad had. And so by that point, my parents stayed in Ohio until about 95 when I graduated college. I went to University of Illinois for the majors, for my studies, but also because it was an opportunity to reconnect with one of my childhood friends from the Chicago area. And so I mean, I loved my time at the University of Illinois. I was very disappointed with my friend because when we became roommates, found out that he had really changed especially from going to public school. And we had met through the Lutheran school. I neglected to say I've been in Lutheran churches and Lutheran schools my entire life. And so that was kind of a harsh reality I had to face. Like, okay, well, now what am I going to do? I connected with the campus church there, University Lutheran.
Yep.
And that's pretty much where, jumping ahead as far as my testimony, where I made my faith my own. The boring answer is how I came to faith is, well, I grew up in the Christian household and went to Lutheran churches my whole life. But I think your faith becomes more your own in high school and especially college when you don't have your parents making you go to church or school. Yeah. And I made the decision and said, no, I still want this to be a part of my life, whereas my roommate said, forget it, I'm sleeping in. And so because I couldn't study in my dorm room because of my roommate doing all that he was doing, I hung up at the study center that they had at the campus, met a lot of great people, and then I had my own locker to keep my sheet music in, so I'd practice piano between study breaks. Late at night you'll hear the Beatles and Billy Joel playing in the sanctuary, and went from there. But at the same time, the choir director, she was a senior when I was a freshman. She saw something in me, passed the baton when she graduated, so I taught choir for 3 years there and stuff. So there was a lot of formative experiences at University of Illinois where I think that's where my faith became.
Yeah. I'm amazed how all three people that we've interviewed, and I'm included in this, there's this really interesting transition where everyone had a faith, had a childlike faith that was theirs. They were baptized when they were young before they really remember, but how they really took to this ownership of their faith when they entered into adulthood. And I think that on the one hand, we can point to that and say, there's a sort of maturity that you have to say, like, this is mine and I own this now. But by the same token, it also points to the importance of having that childlike faith going on behind the scenes. We've got a 4 for 4, and I'm sure it's way more than a 4 for 4, but it's 100 for 100 in the church of people who were baptized, stayed in the church, stayed connected through their family, but didn't really have ownership of it until later. I think it goes to show the importance of having that connectedness to the church, even if it's not a strong core identity. This is mine and I own this. Right. It sets you up to be able to do that when you finally do enter into
you need that foundation, and my parents were, I think, pretty gung-ho to have me in a Lutheran school for as much of my life as I could. When I moved to Indiana, I went to public school for about a year and a half. When we went to Ohio, we didn't have an LCMS congregation to go to. We actually were ELCA for a few years there. By that point, it was high school anyway, and we were planning to have me go into a public school system at that point. Yeah. But yeah, I think they felt, and I agree, that having that as a foundation to everything just makes all the difference. And so then case in point with Rebecca, my 8-year-old now, I felt the same way when I got married. Leslie was a little reluctant, and now she'll tell you not only is she happy that Rebecca's had that foundation, but we probably will send her to a Lutheran high school even with the way things are going right now.
Yeah. So. I think that's one of the interesting phenomena I see here in the St. Louis area is we have a absolute treasure trove of not only Christian education but Lutheran education in this area, and it is so for this is just me personally speaking. It's shocking to me how few people take advantage of it. I know it costs money, and I understand that not everyone can make that fit into their budget. But if there's any way to squeeze it in, it's invaluable for the faith life of your child. I feel like I was in Christian schools, Lutheran schools, up until the 7th grade, and then they had an offering, but it was really small, and it didn't have a lot of the programmatic things and the education that I desired. And so my parents had, I think this is probably among the hardest decisions they ever had to make as parents for their kids, but they decided to send me on to the public school. This was in Bible Belt, Arkansas, where they didn't fear for, the morality of the school that we were going to, even though there were, obvious public school things going on. But we didn't have in Arkansas the wealth of Lutheran education opportunities that people in the St. Louis area have. And had we done that, I'm sure I probably would have gone on to go to a Lutheran, high school as well.
Sure.
And so I want to make sure that King of Kings in general stresses the importance of Christian education, because it is truly one of the more valuable jewels of a life of faith that you can have in your crown, is that Lutheran education.
Absolutely. So. And I mean, I have to give a lot of credit to my parents, not just for pushing for it, but by helping us subsidize it. I mean, I probably wouldn't be able to send Becca without it, but I'm just thankful for it. And again, it's just testament to how much they saw when sending my sister and I to a Lutheran school growing up. And in that same sense, you talk about going to public school at some point. I mean, it was culture shock for me when I had to switch, because we had to move at the end of 8th grade for me. Oh, perfect timing. He's going to go into high school anyway. In Ohio, they do 7th, 8th, and 9th grade for junior high. So instead of going into high school where everybody's new and more open to meeting people, I was at the top of the heap where it's like, oh, who are you? Mm-hmm. Oh, you're a Christian. It was probably the worst year of my life, which is probably what forced me even more so to just rely on my family as my social life, my formative faith counselors, if you will, sure. and stuff. And things got better the next year once I did actually enter high school then, and then the level playing field happened finally and stuff. But there is that little bit of culture shock. So it's like, when's the right time to do it? As I mentioned, my roommate, he made that switch in junior high, and I think it was I'm not going to blame it all on that, but it was a little bit costly that I think that he wasn't there as long.
Yeah, no, and that's not to say there aren't faith success stories of children who've gone to public school all throughout, or people who are in Christian schools who don't end up abandoning their faith later in life. It's just you're playing the odds, you're playing the casino odds that there's a higher probability, and a lot of it has to do more with family than the school, right?
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of other home issues, I think, that played more into that.
I guess this is maybe a good place to, as representatives of King of Kings, to talk about how, if you are interested in getting your kids in a Christian school but cost is a problem, King of Kings does have a program in place, and I don't know how many people take advantage of this, but I hope it would be more if they know about it. But we'll cover the difference in the cost between member and non-member rates at any Christian or any Lutheran. Is it Christian or Lutheran? I think it might be. We'll have to look into that.
I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure. For sure, it's
we're
Lutheran
doing it for
education.
Rebecca, and I appreciate that. It's not a great difference between member and non-member at Messiah,
but there almost always is some difference.
Yeah,
so,
and it's appreciated for sure.
That's not a completely negligible discount.
No.
So if you are interested in that, just let us know. We'd be happy to help cover those.
And talk to me because
He's the guy.
Deal with that.
Okay, so that's your childhood. We already talked a little bit about how you took ownership of your faith, but let's talk about maybe some more specifics. What were some people, maybe other than just your family, your immediate family, who have had some influence on your life of faith and your walk of faith? And then we'll ask another question about how the church was different in your youth than it is now, and where you see the church going based on those trends. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I struggled with trying to identify key people in my youth other than my family. I mean, certainly going to the Lutheran school, where the pastors and the teachers there played an influence. One of my parents' best friends was the interim pastor for a couple of congregations while we were down there. In fact, and he ended up being the one that brought me through confirmation. So I know that Ken Garrison played a role in that, but. I got to high school, and again, we were going to an ELCA church, but they recognized kind of the early seeds of my musical skills, so that they pulled me in with that, gave me opportunities to develop that. So I was singing with the choir. I'm the only one who's a teenager doing that, and doing some solos as a result, and doing back then programming synthesizers and stuff was new, so I was programming backing tracks, if you will, for the choir to sing to, and all that was kind of formative, but if I had to point to the people that really helped me form my faith, it was after college. I had these great friends that I met at University of Illinois, and it was a great 4 years. And then most of them got married to each other, and we all went our separate ways. I'm like, well, now what? And I had taken an internship that brought me back to Chicago. With that, it was like, well, where should I go? I was trying to find a church that had a lot of young adults. And good luck with that in the LCMS, especially for my generation. I was this close to going to River Forest Concordia just to hang out with people close to my age, except it would have been kind of weird because then they would all go to the dorm cafeteria for lunch, and I'd be like, now what do I do? So, and I guess it was at that point, I mean, my parents were kind of pushing me to go back to the church that we went to when we first lived in Chicago. And I should mention Peace Lutheran in Lombard there. You know, in the 70s, one of the earliest memories, this actually ties into your next question a little bit. You know, I remember electric guitars in the Lutheran church from the 70s. Now, that's kind of strange.
Revolutionary.
Yeah, but they were doing that because they had, there was something called Chicago Folk Service, which was a liturgy written by some church designed to be done with acoustic guitars and flutes. They adapted that they had a very musical family under the music director, the organist and choir director, who, you know,
Partridges, was it?
I'm sorry?
Partridges?
No, it was like the Partridges.
Oh.
No, they were the Divics. But yeah, they had like 2 sons. I thought there were maybe 3, and they both play electric guitar and stuff. So I mean, I just remember as a kid going, "What is this?" You know, and I kind of loved it, but it was almost too much for me at that age. But so anyway, when I was back in Chicago after college, people were encouraging me, go back there because they're doing contemporary worship. We think you'd like that, even though I was only kind of flirting with that, you know, from what I described with the choir anthem stuff I was doing. And so I went ahead and went back there, liked what I saw, and that's when it occurred to me that maybe I should be going to the church not to be served, but to serve. And you know, that was the Holy Spirit or something within me that you know, it just opened a whole new door for me. So I introduced myself to the music director, and the rest was history. I was there for like 15 years, and I learned so much from Brad Sturtz, the music director there. And I didn't even realize he was teaching me at the time. But I was playing backup keyboards to him, but I think he was happy to have me because he was grooming someone who could cover when he left. I remember his wife always said, we're just so thankful for you because now he can take a break and you can cover in the meantime. Oh, okay. and then with that, you know, he became a mentor, and then the DCE, who I mentioned earlier, Tim Kurth, he became a mentor as well because he had a thriving teen youth program and wanted to start a youth worship service. And so he wasn't sure how to do that and saw something with me. I guess there was a Sunday where they had the teens come in and do something for worship. And I happened to be the one leading that Sunday because the director was gone. And so he saw me working with them and said, aha. And so we developed that together. It ran for about 10 years, and it was a good match. And again, I learned so much from him about ministry as well and developing my faith through that. So I think it was through serving that my faith was shaped by these two guys through the 15 plus years I was at Peace.
Yeah.
So.
I'm not saying this to plug my sermon from this past week, but I did talk about that last week, where there's this idea of part of being the body of Christ, the church, is acknowledging your role. It's kind of a two sides of the same coin thing, where we seek to be ministered to by receiving God's word and sacrament, but that can't be the end of our role with the church. We are part of a body. We are nourished by the rest of the body, but we are also called to administer and nourish to the rest of the body ourselves. So not just being ministered to, but ministering to others, joining in the ministry of the church. You can't have a full life of faith in receiving God's gifts until you are also receiving them to share them with others. And everyone has gifts, everyone has blessings, everyone has God-given skills and abilities, and until you find yourself using those for God's kingdom work, you don't really fully understand his love for you and the fact that he gave them to you to begin with.
Well, and sometimes it's hard to find where to put that niche in then. Like, you have these gifts, where do I fit in? I mean, you would have thought back then I probably would have never developed my gifts as a contemporary worship guy. I certainly had a love for liturgy and traditional worship, but yeah, I didn't know if I would have ended up at a non-denominational or if I just would have ended up at a Lutheran church or whatever. But God led me back to this church that I just happened to be at that happened to be doing contemporary. And for a long time, Peace ended up being kind of I hate to use the word progressive. It means something different now, but progressive Lutheran church. The other churches were like, hey, show us how you're doing this. And so we'd have visitors and guests that we'd be giving, classes or meetings with, to just kind of explain how you can do it and still retain your Lutheran identity as opposed to going completely non-denominational in feel.
Yeah. So they were kind of on the cutting edge of like a genuine contemporary Lutheran liturgy.
Yeah. I mean, it was very blended. Well, I shouldn't even say that because it was almost like we had a traditional, we had a blended, and then we had a contemporary too. Because they were incorporating some of the contemporary stuff in the traditional services, but it was just done on organ or piano. But then we had the band-led stuff for the late service, and that had a different feel too. But the point was, and I've said this before, I feel like we as Lutherans have an opportunity to do more with contemporary worship because we provide context to it through liturgy. Whereas you go to a lot of these non-denominationals, and it's like 4 contemporary songs, maybe a prayer. If you're lucky, there's a reading. And then a big long sermon, God bless.
Yep.
I mean, you're missing
Altar
out
call.
on some other stuff. Yeah, well, and maybe an altar call, exactly.
Yeah.
But, not much else beyond that. And so there have been times where I've gone to some of these with Leslie when we were church shopping. I'm like, there's something missing here, So I think we can do contemporary better, and hopefully we are.
There's sort of... we kind of are starting to get into the perimeters of this discussion, but there's the idea of the kind of the worship wars, right? And that's a loaded term to begin with. But this idea in the 90s and the thousands and into the 10s and 20s about this transition where some people are highly resistant to contemporary worship in the Lutheran Church. Some people are okay with it so long as it's capped. Some people have gone all the way over to the point where there's no longer any traditional liturgy in their church whatsoever. That's a rare bird, but they're out there. So do you have any contribution to that as a person who has a foot in sort of both camps, where you have a value for the tradition and the liturgies of the old Lutheran hymnal and the LSB today, but you see the value in the Lutheran liturgical nature, but also you see the value in a contemporary model as well. Anything to contribute to that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like within just the Lutheran Church, or
Let's start with the Lutheran Church. Yeah.
I think every church is a little bit different in how they would reach out to it, but I'm not in favor of those that are kind of abandoning their Lutheran identity altogether. I mean, we know some churches around here that have taken Lutheran out of their name and reduced their service to these other things. Again, I think liturgy helps provide context to it, and I like being able to keep a foot in the old and say this is why we do what we do.
Yeah.
And not just do it because it's a song on the radio that I think is really nice on Joy FM or whatever. I think matching themes to work with the message, as we talked about in staff meeting yesterday, if it doesn't match, it's not going to make a bad worship service, but when it all works together, it's glorious. And you can just tell the Holy Spirit's at work when that happens. So to kind of steer it back to the reason why we're really having this discussion, I think it's interesting that it's not a generational thing necessarily. When I've started, so after I got married, that's what took me away from Peace Lutheran, and I've been to about 4. King of Kings might be my 4th or 5th church since being married, because we've had to move around a lot for job issues. And at the last church, where 2 of these churches, I've started contemporary worship programs for them. They wanted it. They found me and said, "Great, can you help us?" And what I found interesting at the last church was when I did it, I had people in their 70s, 80s, 90s who would come up and say, "I love this." And I had a couple of teens come up and say, "I don't like this. I want to go back to traditional worship." So it is not an age thing by any means. It is simply a personal preference of whether you want to feel that constancy with that connects you to the history of the church, the one unchanging thing in a very changing, dynamic world, or do you want to have your worship be different from week to week and maybe challenge you in the sense of why are we doing things this way, or why is this song here, or why is that? And I think that's just personal preference in the end. I don't think one's more right than the other by any means. It's just I happen to be a guy with a history in the Lutheran Church who likes contemporary worship and stuff. But
I think one of the misconceptions I often see is people talk about the value of liturgical worship like it's a unique thing. I mean, a liturgy is simply a way of saying ordering your service in a certain
literally, I mean,
context,
that's what it means.
Right? So a contemporary worship model. I mean, even the model you talked about: 4 songs, a prayer, a Bible reading, and an hour-long message. That's a liturgy.
Still a liturgy,
it
right?
Is a liturgy. It's just a liturgy which we would probably say is lacking in some areas. That perhaps we have a valuable church tradition that points us to an effective way to worship, right? A way that keeps us centered on what we should be centered on, and mentally and spiritually. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think I do like. I very much appreciate the tradition. As a Lutheran pastor, obviously, I think my kind of comfort zone is in the traditional, but I grew up with the traditional. I didn't run into contemporary worship until I was already out of college, and my first church as a professional person in Little Rock, Arkansas, had a contemporary worship service, and so that was my first interaction with it. But I'm kind of grounded in the traditional, but I see the impact that a good quality and high caliber contemporary worship can bring to a Christian who can, in some ways, get too caught up in the sometimes in the Lutheran Church we say, I do the divine service, like that service itself by its nature is divine because it is ascribed to the pages in writ, and it's like, no, I mean, the things that have been developed there are called the divine worship because they center us on the relationship we have with the divine, with God. And so there's sort of this image that people like to think of, we do the divine service, like it's the pinnacle and end-all be-all of any discussion on worship for God. But
it's a wonder that we had Christians before the Lutheran worship,
the divine service was developed. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so, I mean, and when you look at the early church, a lot of their way of doing worship is totally foreign to what we would say in the modern context of a traditional liturgy would be.
Absolutely.
It's not even a historical liturgy. I mean, it's historical, it's a couple of hundred years old. But it's not ancient, right? It's not. It goes back to early centuries AD. Some of it does. Some of it was written a couple hundred years ago. So there are certain things the Lord's Prayer and these things we want to go back to. But
right. I mean, there was a song title actually, but it led to a word from it when I was researching new songs. Paradoxology. I saw that, and that intrigued me so much. And I looked at the song, and it was just the doxology. It wasn't anything good. But that word captured my attention, and I looked around a bit. And I talked to my parents about it. My dad's like, well, what does that mean to you? I'm like, why is that cool? And I thought about it, and I said, well, doxology is literally a song of praise. Mm-hmm. But then you've got paradox, and I'm like, what that sort of means to me is the paradox of worship is, why do we do what we do? Why do we have contemporary worship? Why do we even have an organ, for that matter? We say that worship's all for God, and it is. But God's perfectly happy if we are in an a cappella group singing without any instrumentation, off key, and he would still be thrilled by that. So why do we have organ? Why do we have a band? Why do we have this other stuff? Well, that's to get everybody else motivated, inspired to want to sing their praises to God. So in that sense, worship, the way we do it at least, is for the people in the room. Yeah. That's the paradox of worship to me. So it sounds like a great name for a blog. Unfortunately, it's $3,000 for the website, so not going to happen. But I just thought that was a really interesting thought when I saw that.
Let's bring Gen X back into the discussion a little bit here. So let's think about in the church, but also in the culture at large. What do you feel is a sort of a Gen X representative of the generations around you, the baby boomers on the upper end, the millennials, and younger, your own child's generation of Gen Z.
Well, she's Generation Alpha now,
Is she
as I'm told.
technically?
Yeah, she is at
I thought that
the front end of it.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard 2020 was the cutoff for that, but maybe
2012 I had heard it was the
Was it?
beginning of Gen Alpha,
Okay.
but I mean, I didn't think I was Gen X for a while. I
Yeah.
mean, they were saying that I was just on the back end of that, and now I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You know, as they say for Gen Xers, your parents typically are like mine. My father was on the back end of the silent generation. My mom's on the front end of the baby boomer generation. But you know, so I'm kind of in the thick of it, and I guess there was always this sense, and I'm not saying this to be disparaging, but you know, that baby boomers, because there were so many of them, they kind of ran away with the culture for a while, and some characterize that as, you know, they did a lot of complaining and a lot of whining, and I don't necessarily look at it that way, but it just dominated so much of the culture of my youth in particular, that maybe that's partly where Generation X comes from. It's like, hello, we're here, and no, baby boomer this, baby boomer that, soccer moms now. And I remember, like, there was a Time magazine article at the time, oh, baby boomers entering age 40. I'm like, yes, okay, you know,
We're here. We're 20.
here too. and I see some of that then with the millennials then, because they're kind of reactionary in the same way, and both sides of them have this kind of activist culture to them, like, you know, wanting to make the world a better place, and we all do, but this kind of plays back to what we were saying earlier about it's like Generation X is kind of like, the world is as it is, and I'm not sure there's much I can do to change it. You know, a comet's about to hit the Earth. What are you going to do about it? I think a millennial might say, there's a comet that's going to hit the Earth. Maybe if we all do this, we can alter the orbit or something, or adjust it or something. And I'd even heard that. I mean, with the DCE that I mentioned earlier, who was a mentor, we actually went to a seminar, a conference for millennials, and did a generational study or whatever as part of that. And they were talking about how, like, millennials are going to be the ones that are going to have this change the world mentality, which was very positive at the time, compared to Gen Xers, who they were talking about had such apathy. They described how, for example, that we don't stick to just one job, which isn't the case. I would have stayed at my job. I worked at Christianity Today for about 10 years, and if they would have had me, I would have probably still been there today if they hadn't changed. But meanwhile, they gave this story of, like, a Gen X truck driver who got so tired of his job, they pulled over the side of the road, got out of the truck, left it there, and moved on to his new life. And I'm like, wow, that's really not me. But then they're talking about millennials, how they're going to have this stick-to-itiveness, and they're going to fix things and stuff. And I see that, but I think it's kind of gone crazy a little bit. With the woke culture, and with, you know, well, there's something broken, and it's so broken that we're going to completely change from capitalism to socialism or whatever, and we're okay with that. Like, are you mad? You know, so I see kind of similarities between the two on both sides, and I think that's kind of broad brushing it a little bit. But I think
that's what we're doing.
That is what you're doing. Okay, well,
we're broad, and that's always a qualifier to this whole discussion is we know we're broad brushing it. We're doing it on purpose.
Grain of salt and all
exactly.
That.
You wanna be careful with how, but it's worth having the discussions with a broad brush, so that way we can find something that we can narrow down to from there. So okay. So we kind of mentioned, you know, those two generations, and there's such there's kind of a culture war to some degree going on between the haves and the want to haves, right? You got the boomers they've worked a long life and worked hard, and they've got a lot of material possessions, they've got a lot of authority and institutions, they've got a lot of sway still on the culture progression, even in their aging years. You have the millennial generation who has this chip on their shoulder about wanting to leave the world a better place and go find, you know,
fix everything.
all these causes we can get a T-shirt for, right? And we want to support them all, and in the middle of all that, well, those two are dynamically opposed to each other in some ways, right? We have people who have and are stable and want to stay stable, and people who, in some sense, want to destabilize because they think it's a false stability, right? They think it's a thing that's going to cause problems. I mean, one of the chief sort of accusations that I hear leveled against the baby boom generation by millennials is this idea that they destroyed the environment, they destroyed the world economy, they've made this great imbalance with rich billionaires and all, and to me that's all. As soon as you apply some facts and figures to these things, it all falls apart. But it doesn't mean that
But there's still this animosity between those two, which is funny because there's a similarity that I see at the same time.
Yeah.
But some people say that, like you're like your father, but because you two are so alike, you start butting heads. Or same with mothers and daughters.
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
And then in the midst of that chaos and those kind of polarities pulling against and going at each other, you have Gen X just sitting in the middle going, guys.
Duck. I mean, yeah, exactly.
So what do you have to say about that? Because I think that's a key. I think that's a key role in society that Gen X is playing right now, is the unwilling mediators between two whining crybaby generations.
Wow. I mean, I don't, and the thing is that, I've said it before, I'll say it again, Gen X is sort of like, wow, there are things I can't change and I don't know what to do about it. You got, whoa, guys. Yeah. And the thing is, I don't look at, we talk about broad brushing and all this culture stuff, so I don't have any animosity to either side. Mm-hmm. Why can't we all just get along? And you go back to what I said earlier about individualism. Yeah. And to me, that's more important than trying to fix a generation or something like that. We talk about all these different studies. You mentioned Myers-Briggs on Sunday. Yeah. I've mentioned many times I love this Enneagram stuff that's resurged. It's, the older Myers-Briggs that kind of got lost and now refound. And that stuff interests me because then you can focus on how other people's personalities are, but most importantly, how yours is and what you can do to fix yourself. Mm. And so with the Enneagram, for example, I see tendencies in me that I'm like, okay, I need to keep this in check, and if I'm in a good state, then every one of the types in the Enneagram have their pros and cons. Yeah. And so I want to focus on the pros and make the world a better place by making the best me possible, as opposed to, okay, whoa, what can we do to fix millennials? Whoa, what can we do to fix baby boomers? The baby boomers are past me. It's like there's nothing else I can really do. Mm-hmm. And with the millennials, you guys are nuts. But no, I mean, what can I do? Because you're not going to listen. Hey, what's the 40-something, got to say that's relevant to me, old timer, Mm-hmm. So it's more relational to me than that. And just, if there's ever any culture war, if you will, on an individual level, then that's what I want to address. And I can't really say I've ever experienced that on a personal level, but just broadly, you look at things and you go, well, why this, why that, and what can be done about it, I guess is what I conclude.
Okay, yeah. So let's move on to the last two questions here, and I think they're sort of related. The first one is, how would you encourage others of your generation to serve the church? Speaking to other Gen Xers. And the last one is speaking outward to other generations. What words of wisdom would you have for future generations? And what words of encouragement for those who are growing older?
Yeah, I mean, for the other Gen Xers, I think it's just been more a matter of, like I said earlier, putting feet to your faith. I mean, I was surprised, as we were discussing before the program started, how the Gen Xers are not responsible for decline numbers in church. I mean, there's been some decline, but we're not leaving in droves. It hasn't been with each successive generation. There's actually an uptick. The article I read last night said Gen Xers are more loyal to religion and church than baby boomers were. Baby boomers are kind of finding their way back to church, those that walked away from it. So that really surprised me, because you kind of had this sense again back in your 20s that there's a hole in their soul and they don't know what to fill it with. Well, maybe by the time they became families and well-adjusted, they did, I guess. So I just, encourage my generation to, okay, now put feet to your faith. Now we're the leaders. Now we're 40s and 50s. Now's the time to rise up and do something about it. And however we can help the millennials come back to the church, whatever adjustments we need to make without abandoning our faith. I mean, some Gen Xers are responsible for this ex-evangelical movement that's come around now, but that's largely a millennial thing. It's kind of horrifying to me when I read about them. I'm like, okay, you're just going to I don't like this part of the Bible and rip that page out. It's just beyond me. So when I look to the other generations around me, I turn to the boomers and say, congratulations, you've made it this far and heaven is close.
Yeah.
No, but in reality, it's more a matter of you haven't failed us, is what I think. You've done your part. Nobody's perfect. But I think boomers get a lot of things blamed on them that really aren't their fault.
I do too. Yeah.
It's just because they're such a big demographic, if you will, that this stuff gets lumped on them. So I just tell them to take faith, and even though things, take heart in the fact that even though things may look a little bit different, say in the church or in the culture, you've not completely steered us the wrong way. As far as millennials go, I say, hey, don't completely throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot of validity to doing why we do what we do. And above all, don't abandon the value in prayer. I see that sometimes where there's this almost movement where people say, stop saying,
thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, thoughts and prayers and stuff like that. It's meaningless. I'm like, it's not meaningless. Yeah. It's the least we can do.
It's an acknowledgement that we're not in control.
Right.
And God is in control,
right.
To kind of tie back into that Gen X mindset. Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap up our discussion for today, and we'll go into prayer. Yeah. So if you join us with prayer, and we'll close after we get done with that. So, dear Heavenly Father, I give thanks to you for this discussion and for the insightfulness that we've been able to discover through our conversation with Russ today. I thank you for his openness and honesty and his sharing his story with us, and pray that story might have an impact on our listeners, that they would know your plan for people in his generation, but for all generations. I thank you once again for your presence with us as we walk down this journey of discovery in our discussions with people from various generations. Pray you would help those who have joined us today to come back next time to continue in that conversation. And so we pray that you would guide us this week as we live out our faith, and as Russ put it, put feet to our faith in how we live out our lives each and every day. And so we pray this all in Jesus' holy and precious name. And all God's people said, Amen. Have a great day in the Lord, and we'll see you next time.